I'm Zim, and this is the Helpful Photographer Podcast in collaboration with New York City Photo Safari. To register for a safari, please visit newyorkcityphotosafari.com. Spring has definitely arrived here in the Northeast, and flowers are already blooming and bursting with color, so it's a great time to talk macro photography. This is the first of a three-part series on macro photography, and today I'm going to talk about lenses. Unless you're shooting flowers that are more than 3 inches big, you're probably going to need a macro lens. Although a lot of lenses out there have the word macro printed on them, most photographers would agree that they really aren't. For the most part, dedicated macro lenses are capable of a maximum reproduction ratio of 1:1. The maximum reproduction ratio is also termed as the maximum close-up magnification. Put simply, this number dictates how much of the frame you'll be able to fill with the small object. For a lens with a maximum reproduction ratio of 1:1, it would mean that you would be able to fill up your entire frame with an object that is the same size as your sensor and still retain focus. If you're shooting a full-frame sensor, you'd be able to fill the frame top to bottom with a US quarter. Yes, I'm talking about a 25-cent coin. Because a US quarter is 24.26 millimeters in diameter, and a full-frame sensor is also 24 millimeters. So if you can fill up the entire frame, top to bottom with a US quarter, then you have a 1:1 macro lens. This is also known as a 1x maximum reproduction ratio. If you cannot fill up your frame with a US quarter and hold focus, you're going to have a tough time shooting small objects. The fundamental problem with a macro lens is that they can be reasonably expensive, and they're all fixed focal length lenses. Thus far, I have yet to see a zoom lens that can achieve a 1:1 ratio, even though there are plenty of zoom lenses out there that are labeled with macro. In those instances, they are usually a 1:4 ratio or even lower. If budget is a problem and you don't have hundreds to thousands of dollars to dedicate to a macro lens, there are 3 other inexpensive options you can take advantage of. A cheap option are close-up filters. Yep, filters. These usually come in a set of 3 or 4 filters and range from $15 to $30 a set. Just like any other filter, they sit on the front of your lens, but unlike other filters that change the color of the image, these basically act as a magnifying glass. Oh, and you can stack them too. This will allow you to get closer to the subject as well. The problem with close-up filters is that they usually don't have great glass, so you won't have the sharpest image. And they're also pretty notorious for fall-off, so the edges of your frame usually have this out-of-focus look. Now, depending on how you handle your composition, a lot of people won't notice those problems. The next option, and the most expensive option of the cheaper alternatives, are extension tubes. Note that I said extension and not extender. Extender tubes are something totally different. Unlike extender tubes, extension tubes don't have glass in them. Like an extender, they sit between your lens and your camera body. By moving your lens plane away from your sensor plane, you'll be able to get closer to your subject and still find focus. Extension tubes come in different sizes and can range from $20 to $100. The benefit of close-up filters and extension tubes is that you'll be able to use your autofocus and the other functions of your camera, which means you'll be able to shoot in auto or aperture priority or whatever you want. The last option, which is potentially the cheapest, is to get a reverse mount ring for about $10. These rings screw onto the front of your lens like a filter without glass, and what it allows you to do is it allows you to mount your lens backwards. What that means is the front of your lens would be mounted to the body of your camera, while the rear of the lens would be facing forward. That's why it's called a reverse mount ring. Although you would be able to achieve a 1:1 reproduction depending on the lens that you're using, you are now using the lens well outside the parameters for which the lens was designed. Now remember, the glass engineers that designed your lens designed it with the idea that the light would come through the lens in one particular direction and not in the other direction. Another problem that you'll find when you're reversing your lens is that you're going to lose autofocus altogether. You're going to lose access to your focus ring. The only way to focus on the object is to move your feet. So this makes it nearly impossible to be using a tripod unless you are capable of moving the subject, or if you're shooting a subject that is completely static. So if you struggle shooting flowers outside using this method, well, now you know why. Another aspect of your system that you're going to lose is access to your aperture ring. Unless you're shooting a really old lens with an actual aperture ring, you will need to go through several extra steps to move the aperture, which will require dismounting and remounting the lens a couple of times. The thing about all three of these options is that you're going to lose infinity focus. And that's one of the reasons you might want to get a real macro lens. So before you invest in one of these cheaper options, you might consider looking at sites like eBay or Craigslist for a used macro lens. The last thing you should know about equipment for shooting macro is this. If you're shooting a DSLR or mirrorless camera with interchangeable lenses, putting your camera into macro mode will not allow you to get any closer to your subject. You must have a macro lens or one of the cheap alternatives I just mentioned. So what good is macro mode? Well, the purpose of macro mode is that it's going to move your settings around to attempt to give you a shallow depth of field, and it will likely give you punchier colors too. On the next podcast, I'll talk about focus problems. Until then, keep on shooting.